I really appreciate the opportunity. When I was thinking about what to share, and I'll start the clock so that I don't go over my 25 minutes. I realize in some sense, many of you are further along the path than I am. So I decided to do something a little bit different. I think, what David shared, of course, love is relevant in a business context, but I think it's relevant in a leadership context across all sectors and outside of leadership as well. And so I'll be talking about education and in other sectors as well in this talk. But, how do we know if we are engaging in the practical wisdom of leading with love? That was the question that I set for myself. And I don't have a definitive answer, but I have some impressions that I think have surfaced from the collective work of many people who have thought more deeply about this than I have. So I always like to start with this 1 minute. Some of you I recognize on the call have probably been through this before, but I think it's good to do it again. How do we flourish? I think we flourish because other people have loved us into being. So it's nice to take a moment, a contemplative moment, to reflect on that and to feel some gratitude. I know Barry Waymiller is offering people the skills necessary to practice gratitude effectively, and it has a significant impact on the business. So in this film, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, a fictionalized account of the life of Fred Rogers, the children's television show host Mr. Rogers, there's a decisive turning point where this disgruntled journalist is complaining over lunch, and Fred stops him and says, "Would you take, along with me, 1 minute to think of all the people who have loved you into being? 1 minute and I'll watch the time." It's sort of hard to think of everyone who has loved us into being. So maybe we can just think of one person who has helped us to become a better self, helped us become, a better human being. So let's just take a kind of grounding breath together. And I'll start the clock now, and call to your mind's eye, if you want to close your eyes or just sort of soften your gaze, call to your mind's eye a person who has helped you to become a better person. And imagine them, call to your mind an image of them. And, maybe remember one thing that they did to help you to grow, to nurture your flourishing. This could be a coach or a parent or a friend or a spouse. Anyone, really. And if you were able to think of something specific that they did to help you on your journey, perhaps notice if you feel some gratitude about that. And as we bring the minute to a close, know that if they were aware that you were thinking of them and feeling some gratitude, that would make them happy as well. So that's just a brief minute. And, from my perspective, love is the heart of flourishing. And when we flourish, it means we are loving others more fully into being. And we can create systems that do that. And that's the task of leadership. Love has been defined in seemingly infinite number of ways. I like Murdoch on one aspect of love as the capacity to see, the liberation of the soul from self-preoccupied fantasy. It keeps the attention fixed on the real situation. So love is more than that. It's not reducible to any one thing, but it has this effect. And Husserl talked about a non-calculative rationality, that we would make better decisions if we were fully informed. And the only way to become fully informed is to love. And Viktor Frankl said something very similar, that we can't ever really know the other person unless we love them. So how do we know how to promote flourishing if we don't love the others that we are trying to promote the flourishing for? So I think that's really helpful for us to keep that firmly in mind. How do we measure effective leadership? Of course, there's many surveys and official objective indicators. But I sort of like this question: does our influence on whoever we're trying to lead, colleagues, clients, stakeholders, perhaps all others, including animals, result in shining eyes? And I don't mean eyes that burn with rage. I mean what you see in the picture here of Cicely Saunders and a woman in hospice. I mean, not the heat of rage, but the light of truth. The light that sees the infinite worth in the other and therefore can see its own infinite worth. And so how do we measure that? I think it's very easy to measure. You can notice when you walk into a department meeting, if people are burning with rage, or if they are just sort of lifeless bodies in a system and dead eyes, or whether they're really lit up with something beautiful and good and true. And so I think that's a nice measure. And Cicely Saunders, one of the founders of the modern hospice movement, a very important leader, said, you matter because you are you, and you matter to the last moment of your life. So the medical establishment in her day, if they couldn't cure you, they had no use for you. So you were just sort of, isolated and alone. And she thought there should be a better way to honor the dignity of human beings. And you can see in this holding of the hand and the eye contact that there's a kind of I and thou relationship going here. Even though this person's near death, they have just as much worth and value as they had they been cured. And so Saunders said, we will do all that we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die. And we know from abundant surveys that workers and students and members of all sorts of organizations are not living fully in their context. They are held in social containers that close down this feeling of being fully alive, the kind of shining eyes that we know what that means when we encounter it. It means that we are fully alive, and there's a kind of truth in what we're doing. So, many of you probably know this quote: every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And so what do our systems get? We know from data on disengagement that there's a very low level of engagement among workers around the world. We know that according to Gallup's measure of thriving, that a relatively small percentage of people around the world are thriving. And so why does this happen? I like this poll of students. Well, I don't like it. It troubles me. That's why I keep using it. Showing that in elementary school, 76% of students are engaged, so almost 8 out of 10, but it drops to 6 out of 10 in middle school and 4 out of 10 in high school. So what's going on? We're systematically draining the shining eyes of human beings as they move from kindergarten, where students sit around on a carpet and hold hands and sing songs and learn their alphabet by finger painting. So the creative arts are infused into what they're doing, into this sort of grim death march that standardized testing imposes starting in middle school and ramps up into high school. This kind of individual summative achievement competition, devoid of friendship, joy, and spontaneous creativity oftentimes. Not for everybody, but there's still 4 out of 10 engaged in high school. But what happens later in life? Well, it continues to decline. And for, what are we talking about here? We're talking about teachers. So teachers, it's about 3 out of 10. And it's probably getting worse, I would guess. There's lots of conversation about teachers quitting in droves and a shortage of teachers. But this applies to workers in other sectors. So again, I think systematically draining the shining eyes of human beings is a very hateful thing, and only love can turn that around. Lundy Bancroft, in his wonderful book, The Joyous Recovery, A New Approach to Emotional Healing and Wellness, notes that we are wounded if we don't receive the love that we need. And he says something like human beings were designed to be floating on an ocean of love, which I sort of like that metaphor. But he says there's something else. We get, and this is the quote here, we get just as wounded from not having the opportunity to give the love that we feel in our hearts, to have that love valued and treasured, and to see our love make a difference. And this might be part of the story for teachers who want to see their love make a difference, and they're in containers that have been created by leadership that do not allow them to do that. And so there's a woundedness, there's kind of intergenerational trauma going on here. And this is the case across sectors. So my hypothesis is if we lead with love, we can change this systematic siphoning of engagement. And then the second hypothesis, and I'm not sure this is true, but we could start to explore it, that we are all leaders. So everybody has an opportunity to be influential and to lead with love, regardless of their formal role. But there's global data that suggests this has not been the case for most people most of the time, and we can change that. So if we think that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets, then disengagement and burnout might be the outcome of many of our systems. That might be the main product, whatever else it is we're doing, rather than shining eyes. But outliers exist, and we can learn from these outliers. And so Jim Ritchie Dunham and I and some others have written a paper called Love in Action that's under review. But he also brought out the World Agreements for Ecosystem-Wide Flourishing report through the work that he's doing with the Institute for Strategic Clarity. And he used a phrase in this report about the groups that are flourishing the most. And he said they're creating ecosystems of sacred hospitality. And I'm nearly positive that if we were to go and do a qualitative study, we would see shining eyes among these outlier groups. And they exist everywhere, all over the world, but they're outliers. They're very rare. So if we think about the research that Jim and colleagues at the Institute for Strategic Clarity have done over the years, they find that on average, the groups that they have studied, most people are engaged in efficiency-focused transaction in terms of the health of the implicit agreements that they make, in terms of how they relate to themselves and to each other. Are they closing others down? Are they inviting others to show up fully? The average is efficiency-focused transaction, and many people are experiencing extraction at the lower end. And at the upper end, there's some engagement and it's productive, but it's not flourishing. But it's a bimodal distribution. You can see here there's two peaks. And so what's going on with the outliers? At the lower end of the outliers, there's productive transformation. In the middle, where most of them are, there's sort of what we would call development-focused flourishing. That's a good thing. But at the higher end, the positive upper end, 3 standard deviations above the mean, there's deep hospitality in service to, I think, what many would call a sacred purpose. So there's an ecosystem of sacred hospitality. Within an organization, you will find groups that are struggling, groups that are suffering, and groups that are thriving and flourishing in this way. You will find shining eyes, and you will find the absence of shining eyes. And it's almost everywhere. Whenever I've gone into organizations, there's always some group that's laughing and having a good time, even as the sky is falling. And when you find out what they're doing, they're deeply compassionate to each other, and they understand what they're doing to have a higher purpose than what, as Michael mentioned, our friend Manolo would say in his book, Motivations in Organizations. It's more than just useful good or pleasant good. There's a moral good, and there's a spiritual and religious good for many people that explains the islands of sanity. That's Meg Wheatley's new book that's coming out. They've created an island of sanity amidst all this hostility. So we need to pay attention to that. What is it that they're doing? At the global lower end here, we could call this servitude. And I take this word from a book called Christian Caregiving, A Way of Life. And what's happening at the lower end is that people are experiencing extraction. They're being forced to do things they wouldn't choose to do because it makes money for someone else. And they experience that as dehumanizing. And that's servitude. And we can contrast that with what's going on in the positive outlier upper end, which is servanthood. This is the discovery that love and service are the essence of life, that life is a gift, and that our job is to give that gift back with interest. And that's the shining eyes experience. So there's a big difference between servanthood and servitude. And the question for leaders might be, are we creating conditions in which people can discover their servanthood, or are we simply putting them in this role of servitude where they are objects to be exploited and extracted from? And the same for communities and the natural world. So we can think about love as the center of everything that we might do. And the way I think about this is inspired by Stephen Post's book, Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People, How Caregivers Can Meet the Challenges of Alzheimer's Disease. And on, I think it's around page 143, he puts this image of a hub and spokes. And so love is at the hub, and everything that flows from love is then an expression of love. So if we are able to engage in practical acts of compassion, it's because we love the other. And we know, because we love the other, we know what they need. We know what it entails, what their deepest flourishing entails. And we're not just giving them what they think they want, but we're actually doing something beneficial. Give me another shot of whiskey. That might not be what I need ultimately. And so if we love, we know what the person actually needs, what's actually going to support their flourishing. So we can think about these other things: compassion, helping, forgiveness, gratitude, respect, as modulations or expressions of love. I like this image of what is modulation. You sort of have a carrier signal, and then you infuse it with information. You infuse it with a message, and then it becomes a modulated signal. This is what I think is happening with love. A message signal, love. Love is the information that changes the carrier signal into a modulated signal by infusing it with information. So actions become helping or compassion or anything else on these spokes when they are modulated by love. We can think we're engaging in compassion, but if we're not doing it with love, it might not actually reduce suffering, and it might not promote flourishing. So the essential information is love, and that's what modulates all of these other carrier signals. That's my hypothesis. I don't have a lot of data to show that, but that's consistent with what has been surfacing in the conversations with positive outliers and others. So what is love? How do we define it? It's more than just a way of seeing or some of these other things I've talked about. Aquinas gave us a nice foundation in our grant project on the construct and assessment of interpersonal love. We've adopted this phrase: it's a disposition towards desiring the good of the other. And we can debate the wording of this, but it essentially breaks out into contributing to the good of the other, contributory love, and unitive love, wanting to be in relationship or in union with the good that is represented by the other. And for Kierkegaard, you love the other as they are. You understand that people are imperfect and they sometimes do very bad things. But as in Kierkegaard's phrase, love will hide a multitude of sins. So love is not naive, but it can see past the sins to see the potential, and then it loves forth that potential. So that's the kind of union we're talking about. This is not infatuation leading to jealous stalking and murder-suicide. That was my previous career as a criminologist. We're talking about something very healthy and beneficial. And then I would say, if we practice these forms of interpersonal love, we have a better shot at building beloved community. And these would be groups that practice the skillful modulations of loving care for all without exception. So even if we have enemies, we desire for our enemies to join us in beloved community, and we start to practice helping behaviors that are infused with love that make that more likely. We can't control the outcomes, but we can control the means in a healing cycle of renewal. So that's the key to a beloved community, is that, you know, we stand for community even as we are, you know, destroying it. That's sort of a paraphrase of Martin Luther King. In the service of reconciliation, redemption, and flourishing. I've got about 5 minutes left, so I may skip a few of these slides, but I think that's really what I wanted to share with you, that we can understand love to be the investment of strong emotions in another person, and we might instead want to call that passion or call that cathexis, which is what the psychiatrists call it, instead of calling that love, because there's a lot of cultural confusion about the word love. Strong feelings could be loving or they could be hateful. And so better to think about love as contributing to the good of the other and being in a healthy relationship. And then at the group level or the systems level, what's the cycle of renewal in the service of reconciliation, redemption, and flourishing, where the carrier signal is infused with the information of love to a very high degree. So when we think about flourishing, I would say that you can have some level of well-being at the extractive end of Jim's figure. You know, you can be resilient. You can attain a state in which all aspects of your life are good, but you might not be contributing to the flourishing of others, and other people might be suffering even independent of what you're doing. Whereas flourishing is the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context in which that person lives. So there's self-focused well-being and there's holistic flourishing, and our systems are oriented towards some degree of self-focused well-being, whether it's, you know, the individual leaders who have the big paychecks, or whether it's the neighborhood, or whether it's the country. It's often focused on in-group at the expense of out-group, and we're aiming for something more holistic. So I think about this documentary film about the rock climber Alex Honnold called Free Solo, and it's just amazing that people climb mountains without ropes. And, you know, I did some rock climbing with ropes, and, you know, I thought, well, if I became a good free soloist, that might make me feel happy. It might increase positive affect. But I have no doubt that my wife and family and friends who care about me would be quite nervous if I were to do that. And so my flourishing would come at the expense of their anxiety. So what flourishing is offering to us is the possibility that other people exist and other people have just as much dignity and value as we have. And therefore, if we actually love those other people, we have to contribute to our own well-being in ways that also simultaneously promote their well-being. And we could expand this to all people without exception, and all non-humans without exception, and all life-sustaining systems on the planet without exception. In the context for many people, as I mentioned in Manolo's work earlier, many people will also have a sacred narrative that is meaningful. So I don't want to extract my own sense of happiness or positive affect at the expense of violating the sacred narrative that gives my life meaning. So flourishing has a North Star, and that North Star is virtuous. And, you know, I've adapted this cartoon showing the lemmings running off the cliff to their doom. And one lemming says, I've really improved my subjective sense of well-being recently. And the other says, that's great. By the way, where do you think we're going today? So that's the question of leadership. You know, some people would say management is about administering the routines that serve the interest of a specific organization and their shareholders or maybe a few stakeholders. But flourishing would say the North Star is really all people without exception, and all of the aspects of our context without exception. So one more slide, and I know I'm well, maybe 2 quick slides. I know I'm coming up on 25 minutes. When we do surveys, why do materially advantaged medical and psychiatry residents, people who have finished all their medical school coursework and they're just training in their specialties, in the United States, report lower flourishing than materially precarious factory workers in China, Mexico, and Cambodia? What's going on here? And so I use this image of a section of Sao Paulo, Brazil, which shows 2 very different neighborhoods. And I say that flourishing involves integrating individual, organizational, communal, planetary, and spiritual dimensions of life-affirming forms of well-being in ways that promote well-doing. So how do we know on which side of the fence people are flourishing? It's obvious where the material wealth is, the material prosperity. But what about the other domains of flourishing? Meaning and purpose, character and virtue, warm social relationships. On which side of the fence might we find those? I would ask a deep question here. Where are people most alienated from themselves, others, from nature, and from the sacred? And that might vary in a number of ways across the fence line here. When do people feel fully alive, have those shining eyes, and empowered to care for each other? Or when do they feel like lifeless bodies in a system? Maybe on both sides of the fence, lots of people feel like lifeless bodies in a system. Maybe this image is suggesting we have not created beloved community, and we're not fully alive as a result of that. I'll close by just saying that there was an article on adolescent suicide in very affluent, well-funded school districts a few years ago. And this student was featured in the article. She was a representative to the school board, I think in Palo Alto, California, which is part of Silicon Valley, very well-funded school. And she said, we feel like lifeless bodies in the system. And you can see there's no shining eyes here. And you can contrast that with the warm smile of Akbar Cook, a high school principal in, I think, Newark, New Jersey, relatively underfunded school where kids were coming to school in dirty clothes and being bullied for it. And he found a way to marshal the resources necessary to bring in washing machines and dryers into the school to meet the material needs of students that weren't being met and to reduce this bullying problem. So much less resources, but more shining eyes there. So I think, his book, which I've only dabbled in, so I think it's probably good. But it's called Focus on the Love, a Transformative Approach to Organizational Leadership. And We Dare Say Love, another book about infusing love into the educational process. And then, of course, Michael's book, Love in Organization, goes beyond this. And my chapter talks about some of this work in there. So the challenge for leaders today is to empower everyone to become a leader, to create this experience of being fully alive so that we can promote flourishing in this very holistic way and break the tendency, the institutionalized tendency to systematically disengage people and to focus on kind of self-centered well-being for the in-group at the expense of the out-group. So there are positive outliers doing this. They've created ecosystems of sacred hospitality. We can learn from them. And it just shows that we can do it right here and right now. We don't have to wait until some utopian future point comes along. People are already doing it right where they are. We can learn from them. We can do that too. That's the challenge of leading with love. Thank you. Sorry for going over.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you. That was wonderful. Very thought-provoking. I'm sure others found the same thing. And so that others on the call know what we'll be doing over the next few minutes, I will ask some questions, some of them from the chat and some of them that I'm just really interested in asking. And then we'll have 10 minutes of breakout sessions and you'll be invited to chat to the other people around you and introduce yourself. And then there'll be 10 minutes of open Q&A at the end. So I just want to jump straight in, Matthew. You said something near the beginning of your talk, which kind of was a common theme in your talk that absolutely floored me. And we've had conversations before, so forgive me if I wasn't listening hard enough when you were saying it to me. previously, but you seem to be suggesting that systems can be agents of love for individuals, for people. And it just made me think of The Office, the TV show The Office, in which the comedy, the tension in that is that there's great love within the people pictured in that show, but it's like an act of rebellion because the whole system they're a part of is completely meaningless and lifeless, and you get the impression that it's just a slightly Kafkaesque kind of dehumanizing system, yet they manage to love one another within the confines of that system. But you seem to be saying the opposite of that, that actually systems can love people. And I'd love to hear a bit more about that, like what that looks like in detail. Is it possible for the IRS to love people, for example, or is it more about individuals within systems generating love so people find the love? Yeah, just if you could speak a bit more about what it looks like when a system loves people, I'd love to hear that.
Well, Jesus said something about loving the tax collector. So I just filed my taxes and I tried to be honest. And I know a lot of people are not being honest, and the IRS is underfunded. And the honest people would have to pay less if the dishonest people paid more. So I think the IRS is engaging in an act of love, as underfunded and unskillful as it might be. So so I would start with that. But my next slide, and I always run out of time because I ad lib too much. My next slide was about creating a well-being economy rather than wallowing in an adversity economy. And this is the work of the Well-Being in the Nation network and many others that are coming together to envision a theory of change, to move us out of just responding to crisis without getting to the deep roots. And we waste so much money, putting Band-Aids on the surface and not going to the depths. And so there are groups that have created ecosystems of sacred hospitality. And, I think we can look to the civil rights movement, which, I was just reading a book, which I just have right here, called Beloved Community. And, one of the messages in the book is that there was a deep focus within much of the U.S. civil rights movement on beloved community as the end. And then there was a kind of fragmentation where there were lots of different ends. And so the movement became kind of fragmented, and there wasn't always the focus on reconciliation. And so when you have as your North Star, flourishing for all people, you really have to create beloved community. And there are people doing that, but there's it's not normal.
Yeah.
Why they're outliers. So I think groups have done this. It's hard to sustain it at a high level because there's all sorts of pressure. So I'm not an expert in social movements, but I've had some friends over the years who are. And there's all sorts of processes of co-optation, and we see greenwashing and all the rest. So there's like an impulse, and then somebody finds a way to monetize it, and you just kill it. I had a colleague years ago who was a retired federal probation officer, and he said there's always new programs. Some charismatic person creates a new program, it reduces recidivism, people love the founder, and then they try to bureaucratize it. It doesn't work. You lose the spirit of love. So you've got the carrier signal, but you don't have the message signal. So that's why I say, like, the standard is shining eyes. And when you go into a classroom or a workplace, go into an office meeting, you can see in the TV show, The Office, the shining eyes until Michael, the boss, shows up and closes it down. And then he tries to join in, and he's sort of clumsy. And it's just cringy and awkward. And so that's the humor, that there's a natural tendency in human beings to infuse all of our actions with this message of love. And then there's, systemic processes that shut it down. So we know what works. I tried to create a university course I called Love in Action, modeled on my elementary school experiences. We're going to bring joy and spontaneousness and art and creativity back into our university course. And, that required us to let go of some things. So I think we can find examples where this works really well. And then we can see where for lack of a better word, vested interests or whatever want to bureaucratize it, and it crushes out the spirit. So, just one quick example. There was a group doing wonderful things with restorative justice, and they got a grant to evaluate what they were doing. And the researchers, the external evaluators, wanted to set up a timeline and say, we're going to measure it at 3 weeks and 6 weeks and 6 months. And the people doing the work says, we can't put a time on it because it's iterative. It goes back and forth until we have the breakthrough. And we don't know when we're going to have the breakthrough. So if you measure it at 6 weeks, there may be no breakthrough. You say, well, that program didn't work. Your time horizon is wrong. You're playing a short game. We're playing a long, like we're doing this for life. We're not doing this for 6 weeks. I'm here for 30 more years. I'm doing this for 30 years. So if you try to impose a kind of quantitative time-bound framework on what we're doing, you're essentially stripping the information of love out of that modulated signal. Sorry, I could talk for hours.
Yeah.
I've seen disasters and I've seen miracles.
Well, that's what that sparks off me. Someone's quoting the book "The Infinite Game" as well, and that Bible passage which is read often from the Christian Bible in weddings in the West, at least, from 1 Corinthians, and it begins, "Love is patient," and that's an essential quality of love. Well, thank you so much. Now it's time to move to our breakout session. So I've created some rooms. There'll be 3 or 4 people in the room. Welcome back, friends. I hope that your conversations were enlightening. I hope that you made new friends and that you were able to ask questions and get insight that from one another. And we're going to have a bit of time for open reflection in just a moment. But I want to invite you before the end of the session to our HLA Summer Conference. I've just put the link in the chat. If you are interested in joining us this summer in June, in the first week of June, please do check that out. And there's more details. You can go to that link. But I'm going to invite anyone who would like to. You can raise a hand. You can put a comment in the chat if you want to bring a brief thought or question to the room. And I would ask you if you wouldn't mind just introduce yourself and keep it brief so that we can have a couple of these. Thank you very much. Yeah, Dav, please go ahead.
I'm happy to kick it off. We were just wrapping up a conversation with Marcel, and she gave a wonderful example of love in action, which was 9/11. When 9/11 happened, it wasn't about the self. It was about how can we make a difference for the community and the suffering and everything else that was going on there. And it was like, wow. I'd lived through it, and I'd completely forgotten. And what a great example of love in action that was. And she was also just sharing about how that happened was meeting people where they are as well. There was another, let me be over there with you, and just kind of experiencing what's going on over there with you. And so I kind of pondered the thought is, maybe a source of love is making a difference for others. And in the practice of that, the discovery of self-love.
Dav, thank you for that. It's a powerful example. It's sad that sometimes those moments of great tragedy or crisis are the things that bring out the most selflessness in human beings. Jim, please go ahead.
2 things. One was I just was listening to Billy Joel singing "I Love You Just the Way You Are," which seemed to fit perfectly. A few years ago, Michael set up a session at Boston College, and I was in a session on love and management. And spontaneously, it occurred to me that my interpretation of the series, Ted Lasso, is that what that man is embodying is love. And I would love to talk to anybody who wants to go to do an open house on Ted Lasso and their interpretation of it. But have you seen Ted Lasso? It's just stunningly good. And I think he's just coming from love. Thank you. It was a great session you did. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
I just wanted to share very briefly about 9/11. I started my talk with Fred Rogers, And right after 9/11, someone asked him, what should we say to the children about this? And Fred said, without missing a beat, tell them to keep their eye on the helpers. There are more helpers, far more helpers. So this is not like, oh, humanity's fundamentally doomed. There's so many more helpers than there are harmers. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, keep your eyes on the helpers. That's very powerful. Thank you. Others? I'm interested. I wonder how this plays out in university and the extent to which those of us on the call who are academics or educators feel that we're able to generate spaces of love. James, I see you have your hand raised.
I'm not sure I'm going to have a good answer to the question you just raised, David.
No, that's fine. You go ahead and say what you were going to say.
I really just wanted to thank Sean. Sean and I had a great conversation, and we ended up talking about Landmark Forum, which not everybody may be familiar with, but that sort of embodies a space of love, but a tough love, because there's a requirement of integrity and there's a requirement of getting off your crap and making space for each other to be heard. Sean knows much more about it than I do, but I thought that was a good space for creating love.
Thank you. And I noticed there were a lot of comments, Matt, when you displayed that slide that had the word carefrontation on it. A couple of people responded to that with interest. So love is not always making people feel warm and fuzzy. Sometimes it involves confrontation. I wonder
can I speak to
that, please?
Yes. Wonderful. Martin Luther King said that power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And so I think that's right, and he said it's not weak sentimentality, and, power without love is reckless and abusive. So if we haven't modulated the carrier signal with the information of love, power is reckless and abusive, but power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And I didn't get to my final slide in the deck, but I would have shared this quote that Brian and an unnamed collaborator at Barry Waymiller came up with for the article that we've written, and I'll put it in the chat box. What we have learned over several decades is that when love is present in the workplace, it creates the most nurturing environment for flourishing. That is not just warm hugs. The warm hugs are part of it, but that's the contribution to the good of the other. That's desire to be in healthy relationship with the other. That's contributory love and unitive love, as we are studying it in our program. So I think that the warmth is absolutely essential, but it's not reducible to the warmth. It's a desire for the good.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. And we're running close to time, but Nandini, please, would you bring our final comment before we close? Oh, you're just on mute.
I was at the tail end of the discussion in the group with Liliana and Samantha, and I've been in higher ed for almost 40 years now. And to answer that question, I think one way we can show love towards our students and our colleagues is to respect. Respect has to come along with the word love. You cannot love someone unless you respect where they're coming from or what their experiences are in life. And so the way you evaluate a student's work, the way you give feedback, so many ways to really show, while you're still sticking to your grading rubric and making sure you're giving them a tough pill to swallow about things that they're doing wrong, but doing it with love and respect. They really sense it. Students sense it. And even though I teach online courses, I offer a lot of Zoom session options for them to talk to me face to face. And that personal connection really makes them feel, they always, semesters later, reply back and say, Dr. McClurg, I was in your course and here's something you taught me that has made a difference. I went and applied for this job and I got it. Thank you for feeding that confidence in me. So that's one way you can show love to young people is to show
Well,
them the way, but in a loving way.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's a great note to end on, and relates very much, I think, to what Matt said earlier about assuming that we are all leaders. However you have influence over other people this week, let's take the opportunity to, where we can, demonstrate love and create systems founded on love. Matthew, thank you so much for bringing your wisdom and your thoughts to us. Thank you, everyone on this call, for joining us and for joining in our mission. We will meet again, for all those who are interested, next week. Hunter Lovins will be presenting to us. So thank you all very much, and I hope that you enjoy the remainder of your days.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.